So I'm not quite sure where to start on this topic. So I'll just, I guess, jump right in, and it'll probably just need to be continually refined and approached from a variety of angles and whatnot. And so this one is continuing forward in these questions about socialism, communism, capitalism, looking in the practicalities of life without, or supposing about it, I guess I should say. I don't really take the approach where I'm utilizing, where I come across as utilizing the technical language or definitions. I'm more as someone in the audience listening to what people are saying and trying on different likenesses or suggestions in story form or likenesses, as though I'm saying in question or response, is this what you're saying? Is this what you're saying in practicalities? Is this what it seems like? And so just continuing to talk about these things, and not just in technical terms, but life application, I guess. And also just approaching it in ways where people are kind of making common references, generalizations, things like that. And so just trying to follow through with the generalizations, and in real world practice, what does that look like? So anyway, I guess just utilizing these generalizations and calling it out. At some level, it seems like if we're also talking about this suggested as part of religion, building nations in relation to certain beliefs, then it also seems like this assumption that there's this behavioral dynamic, this summary of human relations. So it's relational suggestions pertaining to people, the image by which we experience our life as personal human beings in relation to the system, and the relational social interactions and growth, and how that is supported in governing systems that we live and share among, and how those systems are supposed to kind of function in negotiating on behalf of our growth needs and basic needs and advocacy for us, right? And so anyway, there was this question. There's numerous approaches to this conversation, this topic, but I use some of our cultural value and storytelling when we're comparing some of these things, whether it be through religion, human behavior, and whatnot. So I had made reference in the past to some of our animal people characters in our stories, and one of them being Coyote. And there's variations as to how people utilize the character of Coyote, whether he's the trickster or the wise one, or the one that's kind of saying the thing that the people don't want to say, or whether he's the one that kind of intervenes into the situation and helps it to become transformative. He has all these kind of just different intervention type approaches. He also has the aspect of him in some versions where it kind of shows his personal preference or his own temptations. And so there's a whole range of experiences you can draw out from him as a character. In general, in some instances, there's his counterpart character, his either brother, cousin, relative. That's the fox character. I know in some other stories and some other cultures, fox could be seen as kind of the Coyote character, this clever trickster one, breaking into places and whatnot. But in this situation, it's different. When he's the counterpart to Coyote, fox is more careful, cautious, and so he's given this ability when he kind of is this partnership with Coyote in some instances where if Coyote, because of what Coyote does, and there's a huge risk, part of what Coyote like comes into play or characters because there's like these monsters or these other forces or these other dynamics, and so he's like a counterpart to those forces where because of those things it puts these barriers and difficulties in the way of the people. And so then he kind of has to enter into those dilemmas and resolve them, or somehow intervene in the situation. He isn't always careful about it though, or these situations can be dangerous, and so there's times where he either gets himself in trouble, goes too far, or it just was an imbalanced, really dangerous situation, or a variety of things. And so then he has his counterpart Fox, which if something happens to Coyote and he loses his life, if any part remains of him, then Fox has this ability to go and jump over these remains or the remnants, and then brings Coyote back to life. And so Fox then is like the counterpart, the cautious one that then keeps bringing him back to life. And then Coyote keeps being brought back to life. So in some ways it's kind of this idea of this cautious portion that kind of is aware of the risks and takes measures to not go too far into a situation and seeks out for life and whatnot. And then Coyote is like the other portions where we can't always do that because there's other barriers that are obstructing life. There's things complicating the situation. There's the quote-unquote monsters that have been like inserted into the situation, and so there's interventions, right? There's things that need to take place. And so so then you have the dynamics of the Coyote and Fox. There's this aspect where Fox preserves like some of the stuff that need to be preserved, like there's times where we have to be about life, and we have to do things in life, and we have to plan for the next season, and we have to get the work done that needs to be done. And so it's kind of these aspects in life where you have to do that. And then there's this other part where like Coyote portrays where even though those are ideals and we try to do that, because there needs to be corrective measures, we can't always do that. Sometimes you got to be up late. Sometimes you got to do the other thing. Sometimes you can't be on the perfect schedule. Sometimes you have to like confront the thing that's throwing everything off base, and you have to try to bring corrective measures. So you can't always abide by like the exact protocol of things, right? And so it's kind of these dynamics. Like some people will look at it as is Coyote the villain? Sometimes he can seem like that. He's not always intending to be that role or that character. Like once again though, like there's different stories and versions and whatnot. But the way I kind of look at it is it's kind of a dynamic of ourselves, like a certain balance that we have to have with ourselves. Sometimes there's a gray area in life where you just have to do the thing. It doesn't always fit with like the most ideal situation. And then there's times where you actually do have to have the stability in life. You have to have some level of structure, some level of cohesiveness, some form of reasoning and precaution and safeguards and planning for the next season and stuff like that. I don't really see those characters as being at odds or like extremes. I see them more as like the central focus of different aspects of ourselves within us, that we kind of have to find that balance within our lives. There's times where you have to be flexible, then there's times where it's like, sometimes you got to hold them, sometimes you got to fold them. At what point are you supposed to do that? You kind of gauge in between that. There's, so anyway, people were making reference to some of the stories and whatnot. And there's different kinds of associations, I guess you could say. There's a lot of times where certain stories and parables mean something a little bit different to various ones, depending on where they're at in life or how they're seeing it. But something interesting I kind of wanted to bring to the table is, so we're talking about religion, right? And we're negotiating religion and systems. We're also looking at these different types of systems. And so something I kind of thought in my mind that was kind of a curious approach is this question of, when you read the story about Jesus, the gospel story, is Jesus the coyote or is Jesus the fox? And these are just in general terms. We don't have to always split these between certain personality types. But some people will say, oh, Jesus is the fox. He's there for people. He seems dependable. He talks about love and life and encouraging people. And, they kind of see him through that lens, right? He's like life-giving to people. He seems to be wise about like the future and other things. And some people will say, I don't know, like he kind of seems like the coyote because he intervenes on the situation. He's not going with the regular protocol. He's kind of mixing things up a bit. He's like, roughing them up around the edges a bit. He's trying to transition the framework of things. He's frustrating some of the establishment a little bit. So it's just kind of interesting to think about that. I do think there's a lot of known things about Jesus being about love, like God is love, and to look out for your neighbor and to accept various ones into that with that inclusivity and stuff like that. And I love that side of Jesus. I love that aspect of Jesus, and I don't think we would be attracted to the character of Jesus if we didn't have those aspects to draw upon or to witness in the story. But I also think, and so what I'm going to kind of ponder is his side, the side of Jesus that enters into some of the patterns of maybe that we would associate with the coyote character. And so I want to think about some of those aspects of the Jesus character. Some of the stuff he says that even when I read it years ago, when I was doing my own reading, I didn't like to see it. I didn't always like to see it because I liked the idea of this loving Jesus and peace-giving Jesus and whatnot. But there were other parts of his teachings that were very confronting and uncomfortable. And so some of those things, for instance, like are the times when he talks about stuff like that reference that some people will make. Maybe you're familiar with it, maybe you're not, but something to the effect, like I'm not looking at the passage right now, I'm just kind of just talking from memory. He says something like, once the crowd it kind of piques their interest. They're like, who is this character? Like, we have different people coming in at different times and sharing their theories in the public square and doing these things. Like, who is this character? And so they're kind of getting interested, and so they're just kind of talking amongst, getting to know what his whole spiel is and whatnot. Anyway, among one of these times when he's teaching, because that's a lot of what he seems to do, he kind of goes out to these areas and he's kind of teaching, and crowds form and whatnot, and then they ask him questions. And then at one point, though, he says, I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. And I forget the exact, like, the rest of the stuff around that passage. But people think about that a lot, like just that portion, right? And they think, what does that mean? Like, why does Jesus say, I've not come to bring peace, but a sword? I thought he was like a pacifist, or he wasn't about warfare. Or didn't he say, like, tell his disciples to calm down because he was, like, what are we leading a rebellion here? So I thought Jesus was like, why is he saying that? The way that some people interpret that passage is a little, so this is a little bit of the Coyote approach, right? Where he's saying, there's a time to interrupt things. Like I haven't come for the status quo. I'm not simply trying to perpetuate the same framework. I'm not trying to just draw everybody to comply to the same thing. When he talks about a sword, it's like cutting away, separating, because there's other language that talks about like a cutting away or a separation or a breakthrough, right? And there's also other connotations to it. It kind of speaks to like a older passage that has kind of like a prophetic meaning to it, where it would indicate to people that he was one of the people that they had awaited, like a certain leader and whatnot. So there's also historical connotation to it. But in general, it's kind of this idea, what it seems like is he's saying, we're looking for a transformation of this whole framework that's going to shift everything. We're not just looking to, what do they say? Like in the Hebrew text, it says stuff like, we're not just looking to tickle people's ears. We're not just trying to make them comfortable in this system. We're trying to change the system. We're trying to unearth what needs to be changed. So there are those portions where Jesus talks about that. There's aspects where he seems to kind of be making reference to saying, we're actually trying to transform the system. We're trying to transform the way we see the system. Because then he also has a lot of talk about the kingdom and this whole shift of this kingdom and certain attributes that will shift the way people think about the kingdom. And so anyway, there's also along that connotation then, because other people seem to come in and they seem like they're trying to like get him to comply, right? They don't seem to understand some of the revolutionary approach that he's taking. And so they have these questions about, wait, what do you're asking us to like shift all of these things and like unearth our lives and transform our lives. And so there are times where he really does have a very revolutionary type story where it seems like he's asking them to kind of unearth and separate from a lot of the things that are tying them to feel compelled to be loyal to the system. And so a lot of them are like, if you really look at it, there are some ways that it's a language of Moses trying to draw the people out of Egypt. And if you do kind of pan out and like at the time when the story starts, they don't know that there's these things that are going to break out, and then eventually some of them are going to have to flee from there. They don't know that at that time. They're just like, we just need a better leader. We just need things to be set up differently. We're looking for a different leader, and then everything will be okay. He's kind of talking about actually things are pending, and there's going to be a movement that's going to move to the ends of the earth. We're going to shift out of this system, and then this system is pending to implode a little, to some degree. And so when you look back, his language is kind of like that, almost like he's saying, just be ready to shift your lives, to question why you do the things you do, all the way down, because we're looking to transform the kingdom. So initially they're just like, I don't know. Because there's also portions where he says, like, once you put your hand to the plow, don't look back, that kind of stuff. And then they're like, I don't know, I can't do that. I have all these obligations. I'm kind of invested in this thing that I did with this other person. And I kind of have this thing going with like this person, that person. And like, then they kind of come to him at one point. And then there's this other thing that he says. And kind of ask him, and, it seems like what they're, kind of making reference to is like, what about your obligations, Jesus? Like, you're connected to things. You have investments here too. You have this, that. What about your family? What about your cousins, your family, your mother, all these people? And Jesus then says this strange thing. And he says something like who are my mother and my brothers or my family? And he says, it's those that do the will of the Father, or like in heaven, right? This movement, those that are a part of this movement basically are my brother and my family and what have you. And then he says something like, if you don't hate your mother, your brothers, or your family, or whatever, then you don't love God or something, then you're not committed to this movement, which that's really alarming, right? That's a weird thing to say. It's very abrupt, and it can be very much be a dangerous thing to say, because it feels like cults have latched onto that and kind of force this corrosiveness against families and whatnot and justify it so that people honor their cult. And it sounds kind of cultish, right? And it's such a strange thing to say, and then you think, all right, I'm just going to pretend you didn't say that, Jesus, because I actually like the loving things you say, but that's kind of weird. And it is, right? It's confronting. It's like, okay, first, hate, that's such a strong word. Why do you want us to hate our family and follow after God and follow this revolution? And why are you seeming to disavow your family so that you can be a part of this movement? That's okay. All right, Jesus, you had me at loving our neighbor and trying to work things out, but what are you talking about there, right? And so when you try to think about it at some level, it simply seems to be that it must at some degree mean the massiveness of what he's saying in the significance of shifting the system, that he's saying this movement is more important. Everything tips toward this movement, this revolution, to the point where if you have to decide between what you're going to commit to, you need to recognize the significance of this movement, even if you have to do it alone, even if your family won't go with you. If your family go with you and support you, then they're in the movement too, and they're incorporated in this shift, this movement. In that they won't, then you have to decide if you're part of the movement or if you're not. If you're going to stay within the system in the way that it is, in the way that it's captured you, in the way that it's captured your family, or the way that it's captured various ones. So at some level, that's kind of what it means. There also seems this connotation, though, as to what he's saying. He's kind of using some of the old language as to what divides them between their loyalties, and that's kind of where the word hate comes in, because it is kind of awkward. It's like, wait, what? That's strong. That's a strong word to use. But at some level, the word hate is used when they divide Jacob and Esau, and the idea of them being loyal to Judaism at the time was because they're supposed to be in the line of Jacob, and Esau was the one that would serve this movement or be a part of the world kingdoms and other aspects of it, unless he does his own internal work and then recognize that transformation. There's a lot more that goes into this whole Jacob and Esau thing. I've talked about it before. I ultimately don't think that it really is a value placed on them as human beings. It's more of the stage of nations and kingdoms that are imposed on groups that they're born into, because it also talks about later when they try to discern between the Jacob and Esau thing, and they talk about it's not a value based on anything they had done, because it was a value placed on them before they were even born, while they were in the womb. And so, because people try to moralize it, and it's such a strange riddle that they're like, what is this divide between Jacob and Esau? And in some ways, it's kind of one of those things where it calls out the divides that everyone is born into before they're born into it, so that they're confronted with the arbitrariness of the things people are born into, so that later through this long process, they can be transformed. Anyway, though, there's this long story and connotation that goes into this divide between Jacob and Esau, and it talks about love and hate. And it kind of picks this like arbitrary line that it chooses to work through. And so one brother it works through, and the other brother has to kind of like fall in line with that transformative approach, while also getting involved in some of the mechanisms that we're all born into. And then later has to like throw the yoke off and then figure out and find that universal value. So it's this whole peculiar long story. But anyway, that's what it also seems like Jesus is making reference to. He's making reference to this idea of the hate, right? Where that dividing line is, this love-hate, this chosen or this following in line with the stage of transformation. They would probably know that to some degree, because they have become this group that follows in this, I guess you would say, like the promise of God to work through these certain divisions, right? And so one of the connotations there is that even though they're brothers, they're family, there's this love-hate, right? And so what it means in some degree is that it divides among nations, it divides among dominions, and it still calls them all ultimately unto this surrender unto the path of God. But there's all these other likenesses and like portions of the story that it reveals through, because ultimately there's a lot more. I just feel like there's a lot to say about this story, but I'm trying to simplify it, because ultimately what it reveals is that one of the brothers, Jacob, does get involved in the business of Esau in terms of like world kingdoms and world dominions, tries to fashion himself that way. Esau gets involved in these things as well. They kind of go back and forth, so none of them ever really are portrayed as like the perfect character. They just have these certain types of emphasis, right? But what it also portrays is that they kind of take on this value system of we're supposed to be like fashioning ourselves continuously after the path of God, right? And not being among the world system. And so it's kind of this way of dividing like the world system and this path of God. And so it kind of seems like the connotation that Jesus is making reference to is if you, at this stage of revelation, if you don't follow in this stage of revelation of God that Jesus was proclaiming, then you're not continuing in that path of love, right? You're not continuing in the path of the promise or the spiritual revelation. And if you're staying within the system in the way it presently is, that's the place of like this whole love-hate divide, the symbolism of that peculiar message there, right? And so seems to be kind of saying, this is the way the revelation is going. This is a stage of transition, and it's such a deeply all-inclusive challenge that is being set up that will eventually be revealed as an all things shift, similar to the Moses thing, right? But at that time, they're just kind of like, okay, Jesus, you really want us to be committed fully to this thing, no looking back, everything able to be open to transformation. That's a high call, right? But these are some of the things that Jesus seems to be saying, some of the peculiar things that he's saying. Is like, this movement will cost you. It'll cost you everything in some respects. It'll be all-encompassing, transformative. You'll have to choose between your family. You'll have to commit your life to it. It is a type of exodus, and some will want to go, some will start in on it, and it'll cost them too much, and they won't really want to change to that degree. So then that's when he's talking about, I haven't come to bring peace to this present system. I've come to bring a sword, a cutting off, and then a whole renewal, a new kingdom, a renewed transformative kingdom, all the way down. Well, you kind of get the point, right? What I'm talking about there. There is like an all-encompassing transformative value. You do see later, after Jesus's death and then resurrection, and his ascension into heaven, and then this movement kind of kicks off and is then transferred onto the disciples, and this spiritual kind of movement occurs within them, and they just start continuing in this revolution. You do find later they do end up kind of having to shift out, and they move out of the region, and then there's this tumult that takes place. Then eventually there's this conflict with Rome and Jerusalem, right, and the destruction. So you do see that eventually that stuff did happen, and he was preparing them to say, like, take this movement and take it unto all the ends of the earth, right, to all the other nations, and keep this movement going, and da-da-da-da-da. So if they had known at that time when he was starting his teaching that this thing was pending, then maybe they would have fully understood. It would have made like full sense. But at the time, it was like they didn't fully grasp like how much of a transition it would be, until in retrospect they were studying his teachings, and they seem to be putting the pieces together of like, oh, now we're starting to see this stuff unfold. We understand what Jesus was talking about. He prepared us ahead of time to understand some of the seeds that were planted, that we'd have to be prepared. And it was giving us spiritual permission to like relinquish some hold of things that was on our lives, so that we could be more flexible for this shift in this movement and whatever, all these things taking place. So anyway, another thing that's kind of interesting about him, especially in light of looking at the different sides of him, right? He has this comforting, loving side, and then he has this challenging, revolutionary side. Is this question now that we have, like capitalism and communism. I think what's kind of interesting is that in the midst of the transition, so I kind of had this question. I was thinking to myself in light of these topics, I was thinking, is Jesus a communist? Did Jesus seem like a communist, or a socialist? Or did he seem like a capitalist? Interesting about it is I could kind of see the socialist side of Jesus. I could see where if you're looking for that in his teachings, you can kind of find that, because the stage of revolution that Jesus was at was internal, right? It was kind of this internal centering, spiritual centering, that he seemed to be making reference to. That was this guiding spirit within that they could also obtain and draw from and be centered on as part of the quickening of this movement in line with these attributes of God. And it was so transformative that they were trying to get out of this occupying system, all the way down, right? Through the belief establishment and through the overpowering dominion and authorities and whatnot. And so in the midst of that, he does proclaim eventually this new kingdom, right? This kingdom and this movement to get to that kingdom. But they're not there yet. So they're kind of in between. And so as they're in between, he draws upon their what they're equipped with is that spiritual inward authority and each other. And so I could kind of see how people would draw upon this spiritual movement that first is inward and not yet manifest outward is kind of like a socialist type vibe to it, because he says stuff like he has no place to lay his head, right? He has no ownership to a place that he can reside, that he's floating, right? He's just kind of free floating through life. He's journeying in this movement from one place to another, basically living off of spiritual responsiveness of other people. He goes from place to place and he talks with them. Then he kind of is open to where life leads him, and then he goes to the next place and he's kind of living on a prayer, right? And then through that, then he gets sustenance. People feed him. through the connection of different people, then they have resources that they share, and then sustenance for that day, right? Interesting is like some people, when they have their debates, right, about socialism and communism, and they'll say stuff like, well, do you believe in private property and whatnot? And so it kind of gets into like, do you have like a stationary private property? And so what's interesting at this time, at least, is that Jesus didn't, right? He wasn't staking the spiritual movement into any type of like isolated earthly property. It was like a full-blown movement of constant movement across the earth, in a sense. And where they were inhabiting the earth at that time, his residence was in the kingdom of heaven. And so in a sense, they were not residing or depending on a type of claimed property, isolated and distinct from other portions. He also seemed to be against hierarchy. His disciples were getting caught up in these certain battles of hierarchy, and he corrected them on that. And so then even in other parts of the scriptures, there's talks about no longer having the identification of any kind of like superiority between, like ethnic groups, religious groups, and gender and whatnot. And so kind of getting into what I'm getting into is like, some people will say some forms of, if you're going like full-blown communist, is they'll at times say stuff like that it's a classless, stateless, or moneyless society or way of living. It's hard to even fathom that, because you would think classless, stateless, and moneyless, how do you even function, right? And so I'm not trying to argue that this is how it always would be, or that this is like a proposal that I'm making, as much as I'm questioning the spiritual stage of like the in-between, the no man's land in between of a revolutionary movement that hasn't yet reached its goal, right? So I could kind of see how people could read that in terms of Jesus, at least in the revolutionary stage of things, seeming to have those attributes of classless, stateless, and moneyless. So I was thinking about that. There's different ways you can think about it, though. Like, so classless, I kind of talked about that, where, it kind of talks about, so classes are groups or economic groups based on status, right? And so no, Jesus didn't have economic groups, different economic groups that would produce certain status. He didn't have that. So in a sense, I could see classless along those lines. There wasn't like elevated status that you could buy yourself into or anything like that. People just had value. They had their human value and their opportunity for growth in the image of God and the centering on God. And in terms of stateless, so the idea of a state at some level, so I was looking up how they were defining these terms. They were talking about a state as having like a centralized government and law and money system and whatnot, like an outward mechanism. And so you could see how his movement was stateless at that time. It was a movement among people, a revolution. And so there wasn't an outward government yet. It was this band of people having this certain movement, of sorts. So there wasn't an outward government and an outward law imposed upon them with an outward like economic system. So they were stateless, classless, stateless, and moneyless. And so then I was thinking to myself, I was like, okay, I could see how a movement, but how do you create a system? How do you create a country or anything, based on these ideals, right? At this stage of the movement. Because instead of money, I was thinking, all right, I was imagining, what did they do instead of money? And so instead of really having like a system or a government, it was just a movement. they also had like the spiritual connection, right? So I was talking about they kind of follow in like the spiritual responsiveness and question, and the being kind of spiritually knit together in this movement. And so you could say, people might suppose though, as I was thinking about class, is the question of hierarchy, right? People would say, well, the hierarchy though is God, and like the movement pointing in our image and our shared image as spiritual bearers of God to the hierarchy of God's kingdom. You could say that, but in practice then it was like this invisible force within that they all shared in reference to God. So in a sense, there's a hierarchy unto God, that everything leads into that shared space of God, but it's a hierarchy that limits a hierarchy in an earthly sense, right? And it points towards, so if you say stateless, it points toward a kingdom in heaven, not really this differentiated earth designation power. And then instead of money, it relied on movement for resources, movement and migration. And that was part of the sustenance, as then being joined into other people groups and continuing the movement. So I was thinking that is kind of interesting to consider. But then the question is, find in the story later on after Jesus is gone and they have this spiritual movement. The spiritual movement seems kind of socialist, maybe communist in some sense, as the spiritual equalizing force, the spirit like poured equally unto everyone, available to everyone, right? No separate property or kingdom power on earth, and no hierarchy among one another, and this connection and migration of resources that would be obtained as they share among this growing community. But and that's kind of what I hear some different pastors or preachers, or some that are kind of open to the idea. They'll say like it could be in the spiritual sense, you can look at things like that. But then when you step out of the spiritual movement and we live in the secular world, then we do have these different designations, these different delegations, and then we have to put together a secular government, right? So then the question is, when it shifts to like a secular government, secular meaning like earth government that is not like espousing to be God, a non-God government, you do try to have a moral compass in terms of creating a government, though, because some governments, as we see in world kingdoms and dominions, they place themselves in a hierarchy as a type of God lording over people. And so it's this mystery of how do you approach that, and then that gets into like later on the growing pains of their movement you start to see occur when they go through stages. Their movement after Jesus is gone, and the growing pains of them growing into their own spiritual maturity, and it doesn't happen overnight, and there's squabbling between them, there's fighting in between leaders, there's disruptions in the church among gender roles and all of this stuff. And so then they have to reestablish order. People will see that stage in the church, the growing pains of the movement of reestablishing types of like earthly order, as almost like, well, this seems contradictory. Why are they now reestablishing earthly order among gender, among hierarchy, among leader, among resources and whatnot? Why are they squabbling and fighting between each other? And why does it seem impossible to do the work of what Jesus was talking about? And in practice now, it's like they're trying to figure it out. Some people will look at those stages and think, see, this does say that we then reapply certain law, and we reapply these certain divides and hierarchies and roles and whatnot. I don't necessarily think that that's what it means, as much as like it's a part of the growing pains. And it is a challenge. I mean, I think that's why we're still challenged with different groups, different opinions of religious belief, different expectation of roles and whatnot. But I think that's more of an attribute of humans not quite being in their own personal centering spiritually. And so some of the attributes of people not really being in that like spiritual centering, you're going to have to reestablish the order on the peripheral. And so then there does become this like sense of when we're out in the world and we're growing at different stages, it really is good still to have like that spiritual vision forward, that high standard of spiritual attributes, while at the same time though saying a lot of us haven't accomplished that level of spiritual discipline, and so we do need peripheral order. So what does peripheral order look like? There are going to be different ones that are more mature than others. You're going to have to reestablish some level of leadership, some level of delegation, some boundaries, some property boundaries, because people are not respecting personal boundaries. So then there is a sense of looking at reestablishing some sense of peripheral order, but then reminding yourself that peripheral order is not a substitute for continual spiritual, the high standard of spiritual work. Some of what it suggests in the high standard of spiritual work is that we actually do have it in us to be able to live as disciplined human beings with spiritual receptivity, to where you don't have to say, hey, don't destroy your neighbor, or hey, respect your neighbor's privacy and property. Like you can get to the point where you just do that. Like it just is a part of you being a good human being, relational, receptive, and we can think in the long run to get to that point. So I guess what I'm saying is when you look at scripture, you can see some of these suggestions of these standards of we could get there, but when we're not there yet, what do the peripheral suggestions of law and order look like that are not too imposing, that can help us get there? What types of world earth governing basic principles help us get to that point? And then through the stage of Jesus, we also realize that we can start shedding away some of the excesses though of ideas about God and law, like some of the like roles and things like that, and we can try to get closer and closer to laws for like basic living and basic order among various ones. And so then that's where people get into ideas of, well, among that stage of seeking to bring more order and less conflict and less harm, then we do have to figure out how to impose some of these like legalities and whatnot. So then that's where people introduce their ideas of certain types of, whether it be capitalism for personal boundaries, or a variation of that along with socialism to acclimate into shared living space and whatnot. And anyway, I find it interesting, to think about along those lines. I think I'll leave it at that for now. This just goes along with some of the ongoing conversation pertaining to this whole like socialism and capitalism claims and whatnot.